Hi guys, it's Marissa from Little House Living here. Today I'm going to show you and walk you through my tutorial on canning mushrooms. Canning mushrooms is super easy and it's really nice to have a shelf-stable mushroom product that you can use in your recipes later. So first what you're going to do is gather about 7 pounds of mushrooms and we're going to get started. All right, so you need about 7 pounds of mushrooms to fill jelly jars. If you're planning on filling pints, you'll need about double that. But I went ahead and filled jelly jars for this because that's the size of or the amount of mushrooms that we're going to use in the recipe. So I used 7 pounds of mushrooms. With this tutorial, you're going to want to use domesticated or cultivated mushrooms, not wild mushrooms, because that's what this recipe has been tested safe for. So, and you can use, I'm using cremini mushrooms in this recipe. You can use white mushrooms or whatever mushrooms you happen to get a deal on at the store. So, first, we're going to start by cleaning up our mushrooms, and we're going to do that by trimming off any bad spots that might be on the mushrooms, especially on the ends. You can see, especially in this picture, I haven't trimmed them yet. So, you can see that the ends have the brown on them where they were cut, and you can go ahead and just trim that off and then just trim off any bruised or brown or bad spots that are on the mushrooms. And then this will give you a chance to go through the mushrooms as well and see if there's any mushy ones that you don't want to keep in your mushrooms that you're going to can. Once you've cleaned them all up and trimmed them, then you're going to put them in a large bowl and cover them with cold water for 10 minutes. This will help get off some of the dirt and any other gunk that might be stuck on your mushrooms. You don't want to can that in there with your mushrooms. So go ahead and do that, and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so after we have cleaned off all of our mushrooms, then you need to decide what size you want to can them in. So, if you have really small mushrooms, you can go ahead and can them whole, or maybe even just cut them in half if that's how you tend to use them. I had really big mushrooms for this particular tutorial, so I went ahead and cut them into slices. And that's how we typically use mushrooms in recipes in slices, like when we're putting them on pizza. So, this actually works really well for me. And then, as you can see, I just have them sitting in a colander in the sink, and we're going to set those aside until we get some boiling water going for the next step. Okay, so you're going to take a really large stock pot and you're going to fill it up about halfway with water. And you want to bring this to a boil before you add the mushrooms in. So the goal here is not to cook the mushrooms, it's just to heat them up so that we can move on to the next step, which will be canning them. So once your water is boiling, go ahead and dump all of your mushrooms into the water and put have them leave them in there for about 5 minutes. All right, so once you have done 5 minutes of the boiling water, then you want to remove those mushrooms from the water so they don't continue to cook in there. And you can do this by just straining it off. We're not going to use that boiling water to pack the mushrooms in. We're going to use some fresh, clean water. So strain off the mushrooms and then just go ahead and let them sit in the colander in your sink for a little bit again while you heat up some more water. And this water is going to be for canning the mushrooms in. I like to do this in my kettle because it seems to heat up really well. I have a really large kettle, so I'll fill that up and put it on the stove and then just have it heating while I'm packing up the jars. If you don't have a kettle, you can go ahead and do this in a large stock pot. It doesn't matter as long as it's clean, fresh water and just heat it up to a boiling point or as high as you can get it. While you're packing the mushroom jars. So you'll take your strained mushrooms, so just the mushroom pieces, and pack them in jars. I am using jelly jars in this tutorial because that's the size that we're going to use our mushrooms when we make them in a recipe. But if you're using pints, you can do that as well. So go ahead and pack the mushrooms into the jars, and you're going to want to pack them pretty tightly, not tight enough so that you bruise the mushrooms while you're putting them in there, but they will tend to float to the surface. So go ahead and pack as many mushrooms as you can in there. And then you're going to take your boiling water that's in your kettle or in your stock pot, and you're going to pour that over the top of the mushrooms, leaving about 1 inch of headspace in the jar. Now, at this point in other tutorials, I've seen where they've added absorbic acid or vitamin C or salt. The first two are just for color protection, and the salt is just a flavor additive. But none of those things have to be added to keep this recipe safe. They're all optional. The absorbic acid and the vitamin C are just for color retention. As you can see here, I did brown mushrooms, so I'm not really concerned that the color is not going to stay. But if you're canning white mushrooms, it might be something you want to consider if that color is really important to you. Like I said, though, none of those things are required. So if you're not adding any of that, just go ahead and fill your jar with the mushrooms and the water, and we will get them all cleaned up and ready to move on to the next step. All right, so it's time to get those mushrooms canned up. So we need to wipe off the rims of the jars first if you haven't already. And I just do that with a wet cloth and just make sure that there's no gunk on them or any extra little pieces of mushrooms that might get in the way of the seal. Since mushrooms aren't very sticky or anything, it's pretty easy to clean the tops of the jar. So make sure you do that before you add your lid and your rim. But once you've cleaned it, added your lid and your rim, go ahead and seal those to fingertip tightness. So I just kind of screw them on and then just give them one little extra tightening, and that's about all they need. They don't need to be on there super tight. In fact, if you do put the lids on super tight, they actually might not seal well, or they might give you a false seal. So once you've got the lids on, then you can go ahead and put them in your pressure canner. Mushrooms do need to be pressure canned because they are a low acid food. But pressure canning is really easy once you get the hang of it. And I actually like it better than water bath canning because it doesn't heat up my house so much. So you can put all of the jars in to your pressure canner. If you haven't already got it set up, you'll need to follow the instructions in your manual. I have a Presto pressure canner. So it's a dial gauge canner. And so we use 2 inches of water in the bottom of the canner, and I get that to boiling before I put the jars in. So then I'm putting the jars in the canner and then putting the lid on and following the rest of the instructions for my canner. Once the canner has reached the pressure that you need it to be at, the pressure depends on what altitude you are at. I am at just about 5,000 feet here, so I need to get my canner up to 13 pounds of pressure. If you're lower than that, it may be 11 or 12. Just go ahead and check the guidelines in the blog posts that I have on this to see what level that you need to be at for your altitude. So once I've gotten it up to pressure, then I will set the timer, and mushrooms take 45 minutes in the pressure canner before you will turn off the heat and lower the pressure. All right. So once you have finished pressure canning the mushrooms, you will let them sit in the pressure canner until it has lowered the pressure all the way to zero. And depending on your model of canner, the little piece will have gone down, showing you that there's no more pressure left in your canner and you can remove the lid. If I'm canning things back to back, then I will wait for this and take off the lid right away. Otherwise, you can leave them in the canner. You can leave them overnight if you're doing this in the evening. It's just fine. So once you've taken the lid off the canner, that you can let these sit on the countertop until they seal. Make sure that you don't touch the tops when you bring them out of the canner. Otherwise, you might create a false seal. So I put a large cutting board on top of my countertop, and I put a cloth over the top of that, and then I just let all the jars sit on there so they can drip from the canner because they're a little bit wet, and just sit there and seal until they're done. And then the next day, I will label them and put them all in my pantry. And that is canning mushrooms. It's really easy. It's just cleaning, packing the jars, and running them through the pressure canner. So I hope you enjoyed this little tutorial.